You're listening to The Jewish Truth Bomb with Lenny Goldberg.
Hey, this is Lenny Goldberg, and thanks for joining me today. Since this war began, I've been saying it. I've played segments of Jonathan Pollard, who said it, that this entire campaign to free the hostages, to bring them home, is really an effort and a campaign to shift the emphasis of this war to the hostages and not to the goal of wiping out the Hamas. Turning the subject of the hostages into something that this war is all about, that's the propaganda of the left. The goal of the left was always to make the hostages the issue and to get their families involved and to make it all a personal issue and not a national issue. They want the hostage subject to manage the war. When the narrative of this war is bring them home and not to destroy the enemy, to destroy those who took the hostages, what does that mean? That means that this war is not going to be managed right. It means your priorities are messed up. And it also makes no sense because the demands of the Hamas can never be met. A hostage exchange in the first place that brought upon us the leader of the Hamas, when for one soldier, Gilad Shalit, we released 1,000 hardcore terrorists, including the leader of the Hamas. So it never made sense. The only thing that ever made sense was to kill the butchers who captured the hostages, like we did in Entebbe. What happened to the Entebbe idea? There's like 3 different Hollywood versions of the Entebbe raid. Didn't we learn from that you do not negotiate with terrorists, but you kill them? And so nothing exposes the left more and how twisted they are and how all along they've been using this war cynically and the hostage issue as well as a vehicle to bring the government down. That's all that matters to them. Because even after Hamas murders our hostages, you think that at that point they would say, you know what? Let's kill those evil bastards that murder our hostages. After all, they care so much about the hostages. No, they don't say that. Instead, they call for a strike. The Histadrut is going to go on strike in the middle of a war. That's treason. And so everything becomes political. The hostages are killed by the Hamas in the tunnels. You have to blame your political rival. Got to get Bibi for that one. And so after the killing of these 6 hostages, the rabid left still doesn't blame the Hamas. Just like they never defined this war as a war against the Hamas, they intentionally made this war all about bring them home. And so what they're doing now and threatening to strike and protesting in the street, they're doing what the Democratic Party in America is very good at. Never let a crisis go to waste. The Hamas killed 6 more of our citizens? Okay, let's use that to bring down the government. We can't let that go to waste. And so they never really cared about the hostages or the families of the hostages. They were using them all along as a way to manipulate the narrative and bring down this government. Having said that, personally for me, I don't know about you, but when I heard that they murdered those 6 hostages, my first instinct isn't, oh, those poor hostages. My first instinct is to want to kill the bastards who did it. I want nikama, I want vengeance. I'll cry later. It's the same type of thing about my son in Gaza. I have a son in Gaza now, and I'm not praying every second he stays safe. I'm praying for that, but I'm praying even more so, and what I tell him before he goes is, kill as many terrorist vermin as you can and don't stop. That's what I wish him. Anyway, moving on. This past Shabbat, we read Parshat Re'eh, and it's a parsha that focuses heavily on the Temple Mount. We read over and over again that we must do our sacrifices and our avodah and worship God where? Hamakom sheyevchar Hashem, on the place that Hashem chooses. And of course, that's Jerusalem, even though it's not mentioned explicitly. Over and over again, we are told what is the proper way to serve God, where's the proper place, the only place. Hamakom shebachar Hashem, the place that Hashem chose. And we read this past Shabbat, how 3 times a year we make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Holy Temple, on Passover, on Sukkot, on Chag HaShavuot. It's all about the temple. We're a temple-based religion. And we saw a couple weeks ago that on the 9th of Av, there were thousands of Jews on the Temple Mount, B'makom asher bachar Hashem, on the place that God chose, praying, bowing down before Hashem. And naturally, a lot of people in Israel, they don't want Jews praying on the Temple Mount, God forbid. And the newspaper, The Times of Israel, reports on this new phenomenon that Jews are going up to the Temple Mount now, and they're praying on a daily basis even. And this is part of their article in the Times of Israel. The prostrations, that is of the Jews there, are conducted on the eastern side of the Temple Mount, out of sight of Muslim worshippers, but in full view of police who accompany Jews during these visits and who previously did not allow such prayers under the decades-old status quo regarding conduct on the Temple Mount. In other words, up to now, the status quo has been Jews aren't allowed to pray the Temple Mount. But now it seems to be changing, and the Times of Israel and the government of Israel and maybe the world are getting nervous. You see, up to now, what was the status quo? That if you think that the Temple Mount has spiritual significance, and you want to pull out a siddur, a prayer book, and maybe just say Psalms, you're not allowed. If a policeman sees you even moving your lips, he's going to stop you. Now imagine that. The status quo is that a Jew isn't allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. Now think about this in the point of view of Jewish law. It says in Masechet Brachot that if the Jew is outside of Israel, he turns towards Israel when he prays. And if you're living in Israel, then you turn towards Jerusalem. And if you live in Jerusalem, then you turn towards the Temple Mount. And if you're on the Temple Mount and you want to pray, you turn towards the Holy of Holies, where the temples actually stood. And so every single prayer by every single Jew through all the centuries has been towards the Temple Mount, because that's the holiest place. Yet, there's only one place in the whole world that a Jew isn't allowed to pray. You're allowed to pray in Iraq. I'm sure in every tyrannical Muslim country, Jews are allowed to pray. But there's one place you can't. You're not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, which is the place where all our prayers are directed to.
I mean, that is something out of Chelm. You know the famous Chelm stories, the wise men of Chelm, who weren't really wise, but they were stupid and absurd? That's how absurd it is. Just thinking about it is more than ironic. It's something you can't make up.
And so people are waking up, the rabbis are waking up, that, you know what, there are places on the Temple Mount you're allowed to go and to pray. And if you're not allowed to be up there, then what are the Muslims doing up there? What are the jackals doing up there with their mosques? I get it. You want to say Jews aren't allowed to go up to the Temple Mount because it's sacred?
And so what happens? We abandon the site and leave it for the Muslims to play soccer up there and building monuments to honor the Shabra and Shatila massacre victims. And it's become a burial site for Jew haters like Faisal Husseini. That's what you have up there now. That's okay, because we revere the site.
Because for us, the Mount is so sacred. And so when Rabbi Kahana talked about the Temple Mount, it wasn't the point of just a Jewish presence. Let's say somehow we get a shul up there, and we get a minyan up there, 3 times a day. It'll be like a shtibel on the Temple Mount. We got a little synagogue, Jews can pray there and all. Even with that, you still have the greatest Chilul Hashem that you can ever have. Because on the holiest site is a mosque that sits on the Kodesh Kodeshim, on the Holy of Holies. And so what's most important is to escape from this exilic mindset that Jews should not go up there. It's provoking the Muslims on the Temple Mount. There are actually entire Jewish camps who hold by that you're not allowed to provoke the Goyim. That's their hashkafa about everything. Lo litkarot b'goyim.
You can't provoke the nations.
You can't provoke them. You just got to sit there and take it. I always wondered, how did these Jews celebrate Purim when Mordechai provoked Haman, or Hanukkah when the Maccabees provoked the Greeks? And so we have to understand, we're not in the exile anymore. God brought us back after 2,000 years. God granted us amazing victories over our enemies.
We have all the signs of redemption. There's a clear ingathering of the exile. Something is going on. The redemption process is underway, and we have to show the emunah and the bitachon to embrace it and stop conducting ourselves like, we're still in Poland. In case nobody noticed, last week there was no show, no Jewish Truth Bomb, because it was considered by the producers as insightful, and we don't want to incite against the law, and so it couldn't be aired. And of course, I'm not going to repeat what I said or what I tried to say last time. But in that broadcast, I was responding to what the head of the Shin Bet said about the Hilltop Youth. The head of the Shin Bet
His name is Ronen Bar. He wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of Israel and the Defense Minister explaining how dangerous these boys are. They're a threat to Israeli society. They're a threat to our security. That is what he wrote, and a lot more than that. Like we have a fifth column. So it's like we have the Hamas in the south, we have the Hezbollah in the north, and we have the Hilltop Youth in the middle, in the heart of Israel. They're an enemy. They got to be dealt with, like the Hezbollah and the Hamas. Anyway, that's what the head of the Shin Bet said after they arrested 5 young men and put them in administrative detention. And what's the background? Well, there's a small Arab town called Jit, and it's right outside the settlement of Kidumim, a very well-established, well-to-do settlement. And this little town is getting very feisty and violent of late, stoning Jewish cars. And so last week, some Jewish youth, they paid a visit to that village to teach them a lesson. And who was waiting for them to arrest them? The Shin Bet was there waiting for them. How did they know that these Hilltop youth were going to be there? Well, they had a heads up. They were ready for them. They have Modi'in, they have intelligence. So think about this. This is the same Shin Bet and the same head of the Shin Bet who on October 7th had no idea what was going to happen and Jews were slaughtered. But when it came to a couple of Hilltop youth vandalizing Arab vehicles because of the nonstop rock throwing on the residents of Kidumim and the murder of a Jewish guard at the Baron Industrial Center, oh, the Shin Bet is all over that one. You know, I bet that these Shin Bet people, the heads of the security forces, one of the reasons they probably hate the Hilltop youth is because they're jealous. Because think of their kids compared to the Hilltop youth kids. You know their kids are all tattooed up with purple hair and dreams to go to America, to leave Israel. And so part of the hate is because they envy these kids who have ideals, who settle the land, who are real Zionists, like these old farts used to be. And so they see these kids out in the field who are fighting for every millimeter of Eretz Israel. Compare them to their kids who are sitting in the pubs of Tel Aviv, if they're lucky. Of course they hate these kids. And so of course they're going to turn the screws on these guys. Moving on, you know, sometimes I think that unity is overrated. What do I mean? Well, the nationalist camp, the Jewish camp, let's call it the Jewish camp versus the anti-Jewish camp. They're constantly talking about unity and working for unity, that's the answer to all our problems. You don't hear the left talk about it that much. But what I mean that unity is overrated, I mean that in the name of unity, we've done some stupid things. I want to go back to Menachem Begin. We all love and appreciate Menachem Begin when he was in the Etzel. He was a firebrand and one of the main reasons that we were able to blow the British out of the Holy Land. Menachem Begin, he stood in the opposition for 29 years, from the beginning of the state, from 1948 till 1977. It was run by a clique of the socialists, Rabin and Golda Meir and Levi Eshkol, and it was like a mafia. They held all key positions of power. And finally, in 1977, there was a mahapach. It was unbelievable. For the first time, a Jew with traditional values, who was the champion of the Sephardi community in Israel, who constantly felt that they were second-rate. Now Begin comes in, and it was a hope for them. And the world went crazy. Not only Israel, but the whole world was shocked because this ex-terrorist from the Jewish underground has become the prime minister. He's going to be a warmonger. And the fact is, after he won that election, the Arabs in Israel were in fear. What is Begin going to do? Now, we know what happened in the end with Begin. He went to Camp David. He gave away the Sinai, gave away Yamit, the disaster of Lebanon. But I'm talking about the very beginning, when Begin started out. He's the prime minister of Israel. So finally, you figure you're going to have a nationalist, right-wing kind of government. Instead, what does he do? He appoints Moshe Dayan as his foreign minister. Moshe Dayan, from the Labour Party, Moshe Dayan, who had resigned with Golda Meir because of their failure for the Yom Kippur War. Dayan was disgraced at that point. He was involved in other scandals as well. He was finished politically. But there was Menachem Begin to pick him up and revive the dead. What else did Begin do right off the bat? Which of course set the tone of what was going to happen later. He brings in Asa Weitzman as his defense minister. He chooses Aharon Barak as his attorney general.
Now you have to realize that when the Labour Party had been in power since the founding of the state in 1948, they always appointed individuals who shared their ideology. And that's the people they chose to all key positions that affect Israeli society, for foreign policy, for education, for the judiciary, the Histadrut Workers Union. But when Begin comes to power, he doesn't bring his people into these crucial roles.
And again, these appointments, that determines what the complexion of your administration is going to be about. You know, when Kamala Harris, as bad as she is, that she's going to even be worse. How do you know? Because you see who she's taking as her liaison for Israel, this guy Lenny Goldberg and these other clowns. So of course she's horrible. You know by their appointees. And so the question is, why? Why after 29 years in the opposition, you finally came into power, take your own people?
What led Menachem Begin to make these choices? Did he lack the confidence to appoint his own people? Was he driven by an inferiority complex that led him to partner with the opposition? Was he trying to just widen his base? Again, the Labour Party, they never face such dilemmas. When they're in power, they make sure to staff their government with their own cronies. So I think part of it is what the leftists say about us today, about the right wing.
What does the left say about the nationalist camp? They look at them and they say, they don't know how to govern. That's what the left says. They say they're the adults in the room.
And you can't let these guys with the yarmulkes and didn't serve as pilots in the Yom Kippur War, in the 67 War, they don't know how to run a country. We know how to run a country. So maybe Begin also felt that he's in power now. Who is he to run the country? I got to take with me Moshe Dayan and Asa Weitzman for legitimacy. But it's more than that. Begin wanted to be inclusive. He wanted to have unity. Unity. Isn't that the most important thing of all? And just like Menachem Begin set the trend for withdrawals from the land of Israel when he went to Camp David, all the Likudniks do this.
When Yitzchak Shamir won the 1988 elections, the Likud won big. That was the year they banned Rabbi Meir Kahane. And Yitzchak Shamir had a clear path to forming a right-wing government. He had Tchia, he had Raful Eitan's Somit party, he had Rachamim Zevi's Moledet party. Easily, he had a coalition of right-wingers. But what did he do? He tossed away those right-wing parties, and he formed a coalition with Shimon Peres and the Labour Party. And part of the reason they do this? Unity. Hey, we got to have a wide consensus here. We got to come together. That's maybe what they say, but it really stems from an underlying inferiority complex that the right wing lacks the ability to govern on its own, and they need the adults in the room, which are the leftists. They need those adults in the room to steer the ship, because we don't really know how to run a country. And I want to play a short segment for you where Rabbi Kahane is explaining this very phenomenon, and it was 1988. And Yitzchak Shamir, the right-winger, the ex-Lehi guy, he was the prime minister, which under him the Intifada started and continued. And like I mentioned, instead of forming a right-wing government at that time, what did he do? Like I said, he made that coalition with Shimon Peres, and he made Yitzchak Rabin his minister of defense. And so Rabbi Kahane explains this phenomenon, why Yitzchak Shamir, the Likud prime minister, feels that he has to partner with Shimon Peres, and why it's the Likud party which is to blame. Let's hear it.
The Prime Minister is not a Labour Party man. Prime Minister is Shamir, a little man, tiny vision. He is to blame for it. He has the right to fire the Minister of Defense. He can't get up and say, it's not my fault, Rabin is the Minister of Defense. You fraud! Fire him! But you won't fire him, because you know that you are going to make concessions and you need a Labour Party. That's why they took in Peres. Peres was a corpse, a political corpse. He was finished. And Shamir came and resurrected the dead because he needed him. He knew that he was going to make the concession and he wanted someone to blame along with him. So he won't fire Rabin, of course not.
That is Rabbi Meir Kahane explaining why a right-wing Shamir would choose Yitzchak Rabin as his minister of defense. And so that's another reason why we see that the right-wing politicians partner with the leftists, because they know they're going to forfeit the land of Israel and they don't want to be alone. And so you can also understand from this the question people ask, why doesn't Bibi dismiss Yoav Gallant? You can't pick a defense minister who's not a progressive? But what? Bibi really doesn't have the guts to pull the trigger and do what has to be done in Gaza, so he takes Gallant and Gantz with him. He could have taken Avigdor Lieberman or Ben Gvir as part of his war cabinet, but he didn't want to, because he really doesn't want to do the things that have to be done, and that's why he freezes out Smotrich and Ben Gvir and embraces the Gallants and the Gantzes. But like I said, it all started with Menachem Begin. He set a precedent
for the right-wingers like Shamir and Netanyahu and Sharon that they campaign as hardliners, as hawks, staunchly opposing any withdrawal from the land of Israel. But when in office, they do the opposite. Now let me get back to the appointment of Aaron Barak. Begin did that. Menachem Begin actually paved the way for what we have today, what's called judicial tyranny. That's right, because one of his first acts as prime minister, as we said, was to appoint Aaron Barak as his attorney general, and he knew Barak was a hardcore leftist, and it was Menachem Begin who was the driving force to ensure that all government action would be subject to judicial review. And he urged his attorney general, Aaron Barak, to be given a larger role to scrutinize decisions. And so over the years, Aaron Barak, what did he do? He appointed left-wing judges who aligned with his view, which is the same worldview as the Meretz Party, which couldn't even get a seat in this last election, but they don't have to, because all the judges are Meretz. And so again, the unrestrained power of the Supreme Court, which plagues Israel today, which we had this whole judicial reform debate about, it can all be traced to Menachem Begin's administration and his empowering Aaron Barak. And you can be sure he did it all in the name of unity.
And so when I say that unity is overrated, what I really mean is it really cannot exist when you have two separate camps, each one on the opposite ends of the spectrum. There's nothing to unify around. One team is going to win and one team is going to lose. That's it. And we're talking about two different teams. And so instead of talking about unity all the time, we have to talk about winning. Did the Maccabees make unity with the Hellenists, or did they try to beat them? And so when people say we have to pull together as a nation, we need unity. Unity with who? With the fanatical left? Unity based on what? What are you going to unify around? The goal isn't to unify with them. The goal is to defeat them. Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And God forbid they win. Because we're talking about a progressive agenda versus a Jewish agenda. And God forbid we lose. And you can learn this concept from our Holy Bible, from the Tanakh. As you might know, I give a class in Tanakh, in the Bible. And the Bible has a lot to say about good unity and bad unity. There are all kinds of wars in the Tanakh of Jew versus Jew. Sometimes they're justified, sometimes they're not. And you can learn with me in Lenny Goldberg's Bible classes. You can Google that. It's a shiur in Tanakh on Spotify and other platforms. And when you learn Tanakh properly, and you learn the Book of Kings, we know that after Solomon passed away, there were two kingdoms. There was the kingdom of Yehuda in the south, and the rest of the tribes, which was called the northern kingdom. And there were constant wars between the tribes. And it's very interesting to learn the relationship between those two kingdoms, the dynamics between those two kingdoms, through the simple understanding of the verses. The first couple generations of kings, the kings of Yehuda and the kings of Israel, they were going to war all the time. Rechavam, the king of Judea, went to war all the time with Yerovam, the king of the 10 tribes. And King Asa, the righteous king of Yehuda, went to war all the time with King Baasha, the wicked king of Israel. And the hostility between those two kingdoms is totally justified by the commentators. They don't say it was wrong for Asa to fight Baasha. They justify it because Baasha was a wicked king. But what's fascinating is what happens in the next generation. After King Asa, he has a son called Yoshaphat, also a righteous king. But what King Yoshaphat, the king of Judea, does is he changes the dynamic. He allies himself to King Ahab, the king of Israel. So for the first time in many generations, instead of war between the kingdoms, we're talking about Jews, by the way, instead of war between the kings of Yehuda and Israel, we have
an alliance. We have unity. Should be a great thing, right? No. It turned out to be a disaster. A total disaster. That Yehoshaphat was wrong in making that alliance with Ahab. It caused tremendous suffering to the kingdom of Judea. The unity between the two kingdoms, I don't mean that we unified, that they became one kingdom, but the kingdom of Judea and the kingdom of Israel became friends, and they had a relationship together, and they fought together. And you know what? That turned out to be a disaster for the righteous king of Judea. Because of that alliance, King Yehoshaphat was severely chastised by the prophet for making an alliance with a wicked man, with Ahab. Now, for sure, Yehoshaphat was thinking, I want to kiruv him, do an outreach. He's my fellow Jew. He even says to Ahab, who asked him to join him in a war against Syria, he says to Ahab, my horses are your horses, my people are your people. Kamoni kamocha, I am like you. Sounds great, right? Unity. No, turned out to be a disaster. What emerged from that unity, and Yehoshaphat had good intentions, no question about it, but he made a mistake. And what came out of that was somebody named Ataliah. She became the queen of Judea for 6 years. She murdered almost the entire seed of David. She was like the wicked witch of Judea. She was the Jezebel of Judea. She was actually Jezebel's daughter. She ended up being the queen of Judea for 6 years and almost destroyed the entire kingdom.
She trashed the holy temple to boot.
That's what came out of this alliance. Because the problem is that when you ally yourself to a wicked person, that influences you. Much more than you influence him, he influences you. That's why it says in Pirkei Avot, distance yourself from a bad neighbor, because you're going to get influenced by it. And so nobody is saying that unity is wrong or that civil war is right. Depends when, depends where. Kol matzav kigufo, as they say. Every situation has to be measured with prudence. In some situations, unity is called for, and sometimes what is called for is an all-out war against evil. Even if they're Jews, just like Malchut Yisrael, the 10 tribes were Jews, no matter, the kingdom of Judah was much better off separating themselves from them or even going to war against them, which they did many times. That's it for me. If you want to hear more Bible stories, you could check me out at Lenny Goldberg's Bible classes. We're learning the book of Shmuel, the fascinating episode of Avshalom's rebellion. But if you can latch onto my podcast at Lenny Goldberg's Bible classes, you can check out and learn all the things I just talked to you about, the kingdom of Yehuda, the kingdom of Israel. All that can be found in the book of Kings 1 and 2. And believe me, I'm not cherry picking here. I'm not looking for something that fits my particular point of view. I'm just reading the simple understanding of the verses with the classic commentaries. And one more thing before signing off, you can join my WhatsApp group, and through that you can hear these podcasts, the Bible, the Jewish Truth Bomb. If you want to get on that group, and it might be worthwhile to do if I start getting censored or something, email me at lennygoldberg40@gmail.com, lennygoldberg40, Lenny with 2 N's, the number 40, @gmail.com. Email me and give me a phone number, and I'll put you on my WhatsApp list. And then you'll hear everything I have to say, uncensored, unfiltered.